The scream is already gone when Detective Claire Monroe steps into the hallway, and the house holds its breath. Mark Rivera said, "No prints yet, just silence." Claire lifts a small shoe and swallows the taste of copper fear. Chief Ellen Porter said, "Control the perimeter, and no leaks." A muted television glows with Ethan Vale smiling at a charity gala, a grin that feels wrong here. Tessa Ward said, "I heard glass." Then nothing, and her voice shakes like a loose bulb. Noah Briggs said, "I was passing with my dog, that's all." Claire kneels by Lily Carter, and the air turns heavy as a prayer that arrives too late. Claire said, "Someone staged this, and the clock on the stove blinks the same cold minute." Mark said, "We need the mother," and the floor seems to tilt toward the bedroom. Claire whispers a vow that sounds like thunder in her chest. Dawn hesitates, and the house looks smaller, as if guilt shrank the walls. Claire Monroe said, "Seal every room," while Mark Rivera logged each footprint like a prayer. Chief Ellen Porter said, "Media waits, and the word tastes like smoke." Tessa Ward said, "She asked about stars yesterday," and the sentence breaks in the middle. Noah Briggs said, "You think I did this," and fear frays his voice. Claire studies a flyer for Ethan Vale's youth center, found under a magnet, and the timing needles her. Claire said, "Lily Carter deserves our best hour, not our fastest headline." Mark said, "Then we start with the window," and the tape measure sings as it extends. Ellen said, "Clock is brutal, but her eyes soften." Claire presses her palm to the sill and feels cold that has nothing to do with the rain. The neighborhood wakes to sirens like a bad hymn, and Claire walks the yard tracing paths no one admits. Mark Rivera said, "The latch is new," and metal clicks under his thumb. Ellen Porter said, "Press at 9, and the sky lowers with it." Tessa Ward said, "Lily Carter loved constellations," and the word love drops heavy. Noah Briggs said, "I saw a gray sedan, and the color drains the morning." The flyer shows Ethan Vale cutting a ribbon. Neat smile, neat hands, too neat. Claire said, "Names are doors," and she writes each one twice, then underlines once. Mark said, "Wind carried glass inward, and a pattern begins to breathe." Somewhere a lawn sprinkler starts and time mocks everyone. Reporters gather like crows, and Ellen Porter draws a line they cannot cross. Claire Monroe said, "No theatrics," and the words steady her pulse. Mark Rivera said, "Latch replaced last week, and receipts bloom in his folder." Tessa Ward said, "A man asked the time at dusk, and fear lifts the hairs on her wrist." Noah Briggs said, "I fixed a light there, pointing toward the alley that drinks shadows." Ethan Vale's foundation van drove this street at noon, a fact that sits wrong and patient. Claire said, "We test every alibi, and pens move like small metronomes." Mark said, "The pattern is inward, not shattered," and the silence nods back. Ellen says nothing to the press, which is saying everything. By late afternoon the house exhales, but the chill stays. Claire Monroe said, "Someone rehearsed this," and the word rehearsed lands like a gavel. Mark Rivera said, "Clean entry, dirty truth," and he tapes a sketch to the wall. Chief Ellen Porter said, "We brief at 6, and every minute groans." Tessa Ward said she left a drawing under the fridge, and Claire slides it out with care. Noah Briggs said, "Am I cleared?" and nobody answers. Ethan Vale's name appears in a donor ledger, tucked behind a bill, and the ink feels fresh. Claire said, "The circle tightens, and the room seems to step closer." Mark said, "We followed the ledger, and a line connects to a gray sedan." Somewhere a music box stops mid-note, and the silence sharpens. The Carter living room feels smaller with grief stretching its seams, and Claire Monroe whispers, "We walk with their weight now." Mark Rivera said, "Every photo has a voice," and his finger traced Lily Carter's smile on the mantel. Chief Ellen Porter said, "Families crack or harden here," and her words carried steel. Margaret Carter, the mother, said she was afraid of the dark, and her eyes folded into shadows. Ethan Vale's glossy brochure lies on the table, and Claire wonders why his name won't leave. Tessa Ward said she liked to draw wings, and the confession trembled. Noah Briggs said she waved yesterday, and the echo hurts. Claire said, we owe her more than pity, and silence answered. The clock ticks louder than the heart, daring everyone to keep breathing. Rain lingers on the porch roof as Claire Monroe said, the ground tells stories, while kneeling by a muddy shoeprint. Mark Rivera said, 2 sizes too large, and he measured the impression. Ellen Porter said, neighbors watched, and pointed to windows like accusing eyes. Margaret Carter said, she never wore shoes inside, her voice breaking like glass. Tessa Ward said, I saw a shadow run, and she hugged her coat tighter. Noah Briggs said, that wasn't me, his jaw sharp with fear. Ethan Vale's youth center van parked here once, a memory neighbors swear by. Claire said, we test tread against tread, and her pencil danced on the sketchpad. The rain starts again, thin and needling, pulling goosebumps out of skin. At the station, walls hum with fluorescent unease. Claire Monroe said, pattern doesn't lie, as she spread evidence photos across the table. Mark Rivera said, shoes, glass window, his pen tapping rhythm. Ellen Porter said, press in 1 hour, her eyes sharp. Margaret Carter sat quiet, hands ringing prayers. Tessa Ward said she drew stars here as she traced a doodle on scrap paper. Noah Briggs said, my dog barked at midnight, and guilt clung to the words. Ethan Vale's name emerges from donor records, neat ink too clean. Claire said, lines connect wrong men to right crimes, and she drew arrows. The station clock ticked toward the press, pulling them all closer to exposure. The press gathers outside like vultures, and Claire Monroe said, words will bleed, bracing herself. Ellen Porter said, stay inside, but reporters clawed for cracks. Mark Rivera said, ledger points Val's way, showing receipts. Margaret Carter said, why would he hurt her? Disbelief fraying her tone. Tessa Ward said, he visited the cafe, and her hands shook. Noah Briggs said, I fixed the youth center lock, and silence turned weighty. Claire said, every door tells who opened it, her gaze cutting. Ellen Porter stepped forward, shoulders squared against cameras. Flashbulbs lit the grief like lightning. Undo. The truth waited, restless beneath headlines already written. Evening shadows settle, and Claire Monroe said, grief eats clock hands, staring at the board. Mark Rivera said, Vale funds everything near her school, lines traced on map. Ellen Porter said, evidence is thin, her tone clipped. Margaret Carter said, she wanted a telescope, and her sob cracked. Tessa Ward said, the sedan had tinted glass, and details stung the air. Noah Briggs said, I saw it twice, his voice thinned. Claire said, the center binds him to her, eyes narrowing. Ellen Porter said, we'll bring him in, though doubt flickered. Mark said, threads tighten, and the room bristled with urgency. Silence held, heavy as guilt. The rain is gone, but tension clings to the streets like fog. Claire Monroe said, every shadow holds a name, as she studied tire tracks by the curb. Mark Rivera said, too shallow for rain, too recent to ignore, and snapped photos. Chief Ellen Porter said, we cannot chase ghosts, yet her fingers tightened on her coat. Margaret Carter said, she begged me not to walk alone, her voice unraveling in grief. Tessa Ward said, I saw that same sedan again, and fear trembled in her tone. Noah Briggs said, Vale owns a garage downstreet, with guilt sharpening his stare. Ethan Vale's face on a billboard smiled like an alibi too perfect. Claire whispered, the street speaks when we listen, as the silence pressed in. Inside the garage, the air smelled of oil and secrets. Claire Monroe said, this floor was cleaned too well, her hand grazing concrete. Mark Rivera said, bleach hides stories, his eyes narrowing. Ellen Porter said, we need a warrant, though impatience throbbed in her voice. Margaret Carter said, She hated cars, her whisper lost in echoes. "Tessa Ward," said that sedan Fitz, pointing to a covered vehicle. "Noah Briggs," said, "I fixed locks here," and silence curved sharp. Ethan Vale's name etched on paperwork rested in plain sight. Claire said, "He hid her path with polish, writing notes fast." The garage light flickered once, and everyone froze. The interrogation room hummed with fluorescent threat. Claire Monroe said, "Every answer weighs twice," her voice steady. Mark Rivera said, "The sedan is yours," sliding a photo across. Ellen Porter said, "Talk now or later," her tone sharp. Margaret Carter sat outside, head in hands, trembling. Tessa Ward said, "I won't lie for him," tears burning her cheeks. Noah Briggs said, "He paid me to fix locks," his words cracking. Ethan Vale said, "You're chasing shadows," a smile too calm for truth. Claire said, "Shadows belong to bodies," eyes drilling into him. The silence stretched thin, snapping nerves like brittle glass. Evening settles with red sky bleeding across rooftops. Claire Monroe said, "The city hides him," her tone heavy. Mark Rivera said, "Phone logs place him near school, flipping a page." Ellen Porter said, "Evidence must hold," though her stare was restless. Margaret Carter said, "She dreamed of being an astronaut," and her voice broke on dream. Tessa Ward said, "I saw her laugh there once," pointing at a playground photo. Noah Briggs said, "He drove there often," and fear sat heavy. Ethan Vale's campaign posters littered corners, faces grinning too bright. Claire said, "Truth burns through paper," scribbling in her notebook. The dusk hummed with more secrets than answers. The board now tangled with strings and names. A web choking the room. Claire Monroe said, "Each knot bleeds her story," pinning photos. Mark Rivera said, "Vale is the center," and his pen jabbed the map. Ellen Porter said, "We push tomorrow, the decision carved in stone." Margaret Carter said, "I just want her found," and tears blurred her vision. Tessa Ward said, "I saw him watch her," trembling as truth spilled. Noah Briggs said, "I can't hide anymore," his confession fragile. Ethan Vale's smile in a photo stared back like a dare. Claire said, "We break him open," fire in her eyes. The silence roared louder than any storm. The storm returned, lightning cutting the sky as truth clawed closer. Claire Monroe said, "The ledger bleeds his name," slamming papers down. Mark Rivera said, "Every dollar leads to the center," his voice sharp. Chief Ellen Porter said, "We'll bring him in again," though her jaw trembled. Margaret Carter said, "He smiled at her birthday, and the memory cracked her strength." Tessa Ward said, "I served him coffee that night," and fear gripped her hands. Noah Briggs said, "He told me not to talk," shame dripping. Ethan Vale said, "You were desperate hunters chasing shadows," his grin wrong. Claire whispered, "Shadows turn when light burns," and thunder shook the room. Night dragged heavy as the team sifted timelines like shards of glass. Claire Monroe said, "He vanished for 3 hours," her eyes narrowing. Mark Rivera said, "Logs put him near the woods, circling the map." Ellen Porter said, without proof, "It's smoke," yet her voice faltered. Margaret Carter said, "She loved that trail," and her grief grew sharper. Tessa Ward said, "I saw his van near the school," and regret flooded her tone. Noah Briggs said, "He paid me that night," his face pale. Ethan Vale said, "You will break before I do," his defiance echoing. Claire said, "We break tonight," and the map glowed under the lamp. The woods whispered with secrets as flashlights carved the dark. Claire Monroe said, her steps ended here, crouching low. Mark Rivera said, "Impressions, small and fading, pointing to mud." Ellen Porter said, "Lock perimeter," her voice hard. Margaret Carter said, "She picked wildflowers here," sobbing. Tessa Ward said, "I saw someone move," panic in her breath. Noah Briggs said, "That's where he parked," pointing. Ethan Vale's scarf lay half buried, taunting. Claire said, He stood here, fire in her tone. Lightning cracked, and the night felt alive with betrayal. Back in the station, silence hit harder than rain. Claire Monroe said, "The scarf breaks him," eyes blazing. Mark Rivera said, "Chain of custody is clean," nodding. Ellen Porter said, "Press will eat us alive," bitterness in her tone. Margaret Carter said, "She wore that scarf once," tears slipping. Tessa Ward said, "He hid it on purpose," her voice rising. Noah Briggs said, "I knew shame heavy." Ethan Vale said, "Circumstance isn't guilt," smirking. Claire whispered, "Guilt bleeds louder than proof," gripping the evidence. The walls closed in, holding secrets no longer safe. The truth clawed out in shards as threads snapped. Claire Monroe said, "He isn't just the face, he is the hand," fury in her tone. Mark Rivera said, "Payments to silence Briggs," voice steady. Ellen Porter said, "Veil runs deeper than this case," fear glinting. Margaret Carter said, "You all knew and waited," rage flooding her words. Tessa Ward said, "I should have spoken sooner," guilt tightening her breath. Noah Briggs said, "He owned me," confession spilling. Ethan Vale said, "Control is survival," cold and sharp. Claire said, "Your control ends tonight," her vow iron. The storm outside screamed like justice breaking chains. The night cracked open with urgency as sirens carved through silence. Claire Monroe said, "He runs when cornered," her eyes burning. Mark Rivera said, "Tracker pinged near the river," holding his phone tight. Chief Ellen Porter said, "No mistakes tonight," her voice iron. Margaret Carter said, "Bring him back alive," hope tangled in pain. Tessa Ward said, "I'll swear to testify," courage shaking. Noah Briggs said, "I'll point the way," guilt cutting him open. Ethan Vale's face flashed across the radio bulletin, arrogance in every word. Claire whispered, "The chase ends where truth waits," as thunder rolled. Rain lashed hard as flashlights cut alleys wide with fear. Claire Monroe said, "He's bleeding time," voice ragged. Mark Rivera said, "Footprints veer left, guiding with torch." Ellen Porter said, "Units flank bridge," radio crackling sharp. Margaret Carter said, "Please find her truth," her cry echoing. Tessa Ward said, "He looked back at me once," shuddering. Noah Briggs said, "He's armed," warning low. Ethan Vale said, "I control the ending," his voice in a message left behind. Claire said, "Not anymore," teeth clenched. The city howled as storm and chase fused into one. The bridge roared with rushing water as flashlights pierced the rain veil. Claire Monroe said, "He's cornered," her voice low. Mark Rivera said, "North rail broken," pointing at jagged steel. Ellen Porter said, "Hold positions," radio hissing. Margaret Carter said, "Don't let him vanish again," her plea cutting air. Tessa Ward said, "That's his van," pointing to shadows. Noah Briggs said, "He ditched it for escape," bitter. Ethan Vale said, "Freedom is mine," his voice echoing across rain. Claire said, "No freedom without consequence," eyes blazing. The river screamed louder, daring fate to choose sides. Lightning split the sky as confrontation erupted. Claire Monroe said, "You took her voice," fury spilling. Ethan Vale said she was weakness, venomous. Mark Rivera said, "Confess now," pistol steady. Ellen Porter said, "Stand down," her tone commanding. Margaret Carter said, "Say her name," breaking. Tessa Ward said, "I'll testify," trembling. Noah Briggs said, "I obeyed your orders," confessing. Ethan Vale said, "Your pawns," smirk sharp. Claire said, "Not tonight," lunging forward. Thunder rolled as truth struck harder than storm. Time fractured as choices locked into place. Claire Monroe said, "This ends," fire in her voice. Ethan Vale said, "I will never break," defiant. Mark Rivera said, "Enough," pulling restraints. Ellen Porter said, "Chain him now," voice firm. Margaret Carter said, Justice is her name, whisper shaking. Tessa Ward said, truth will stand, conviction burning. Noah Briggs said, I'll testify too, breath heavy. Ethan Vale said, you think you've won, sneer faltering. Claire said, she wins tonight, final vow iron. Rain slowed, as if even the storm bowed to closure. The storm passed, but its echo lingered, leaving streets washed and raw as the world tried to breathe again. Claire Monroe said, the chains are on, but justice weighs heavier, her tone steady, though her eyes carried fatigue. Mark Rivera said, we closed one chapter, but the ink smears into another, his hand dragging across the paperwork. Chief Ellen Porter said, the mayor will demand results that match headlines, her voice a blend of authority and weariness. Margaret Carter said, nothing matches the silence in her room, her voice breaking against the cold edge of memory. Tessa Ward said, I will stand in court and speak, no matter how my hands shake, and determination lit her tired face. Noah Briggs said, my words will condemn me too, but they must be spoken, guilt pressing hard into his jawline. Ethan Vale sat in chains, expression carved from arrogance, yet a flicker of fear showed in the corner of his smile. Claire whispered, fear is the first honest thing you've given, and her voice cut like frost. Station lights hummed steady, offering no comfort, and every sound felt like a verdict being written. The courthouse steps echoed like hollow drums as the day of reckoning began to take shape. Claire Monroe said, crowds do not know truth, only spectacle, her jaw clenched. Mark Rivera said, they want a villain wrapped in chains, steady as he adjusted his tie. Chief Ellen Porter said, cameras will tear us open, her eyes sweeping across flashing bulbs. Margaret Carter said, they only want her name spoken, not erased, her hand trembling as she clutched a photo. Tessa Ward said, I see every shutter like a bullet, her eyes darting. Noah Briggs said, each lens reflects my betrayal, his shoulders bent. Ethan Vale said, fame was always mine, even now, his arrogance polished despite shackles. Claire whispered, fame rots faster than truth, her words a vow. The press screamed questions, microphones lunging forward, as thunderless clouds pressed heavy over the city. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with judgment, every cough and shuffle magnified. Claire Monroe said, we speak not for ourselves but for the silenced, her eyes burning with resolve. Mark Rivera said, evidence is the spine of truth, steady as he laid files before the jury. Chief Ellen Porter said, this must hold beyond politics, her whisper edged in steel. Margaret Carter said, her laugh deserves memory, not whispers, her grief pushing through trembling lips. Tessa Ward said, I will not hide his presence at the cafe, her voice cracked yet stood tall. Noah Briggs said, he bought my silence but no more, guilt breaking through. Ethan Vale said, you mistake loyalty for weakness, his smirk faltering. Claire whispered, weakness is hiding behind lies, her voice cold as glass. The gavel struck, and the weight of silence pinned every heart to the wooden floor. The testimonies carved wounds open, as truth clawed free from trembling lips. Claire Monroe said, every fact is a nail in his mask, eyes fixed on Vale. Mark Rivera said, the sedan, the scarf, the ledger. All roads bend to him, his voice sharp as steel. Chief Ellen Porter said, our job ends when justice begins, her tone clipped. Margaret Carter said, her shoes still wait at the door, breaking into tears. Tessa Ward said, he lingered longer than customers do, her words shaking. Noah Briggs said, I obeyed his threats, each word steeped in shame. Ethan Vale said, fear binds you more than chains, sneering. Claire whispered, chains are honesty for men like you, fury controlled. The gallery held its breath as silence thundered louder than any verdict. The gavel struck again, final echoes bouncing like stones into silence, the room heavy with truths laid bare. Claire Monroe said, the jury will weigh her silence against his lies, her voice level yet trembling. Mark Rivera said, we gave them everything. Ledger, scarf, witness, confession. his jaw tight. Chief Ellen Porter said, "Now the law must breathe," though her gaze betrayed relief and dread entwined. Margaret Carter said, "I will wait for her voice in dreams," her words soft but piercing. Tessa Ward said, "I am no longer afraid," shoulders finally lifted. Noah Briggs said, "I'll carry the stain forever," his tone hollow. Ethan Vale said, "They cannot kill what I built," defiance cracked but still sharp. Claire whispered, "She lives in the space between justice and memory," and the silence became a hymn. Outside, the courthouse bell rang, each toll carrying Lily's name. The courthouse emptied into silence, footsteps fading like ghosts. Claire Monroe said, "Justice breathes but never fills the lungs," her words drifting. Mark Rivera said, "Verdict carries weight but not peace," his voice steady but low. Chief Ellen Porter said, "The city will remember headlines, not heartbeats, eyes narrowing." Margaret Carter said, her room waits untouched and grief twisted her shoulders. Tessa Ward said, "I will not look away again," her voice cracked. Noah Briggs said, "I confessed, yet chains stay on me hollow." Ethan Vale said, "Chains are my crown, arrogance fading at edges." Claire whispered, "Her name outlives you," and her hand brushed the evidence photo. The courthouse bell tolled again, heavy and final. The night air was sharp as glass, yet the city seemed unaware of the ache inside its bones. Claire Monroe said, "Truth has scars we carry home," voice trembling. Mark Rivera said, "Scars prove survival, though fatigue pulled at his eyes." Ellen Porter said, "Tomorrow another case begins," her tone steel. Margaret Carter said, "Tomorrow never brings her back," her grief raw, doubt. Tessa Ward said, "I'll keep her drawing safe," clutching a folder. Noah Briggs said, "I pray forgiveness comes, shame pouring out." Ethan Vale said, "Forgiveness is weakness," his sneer weak. Claire whispered, "Weakness is hiding in lies," her eyes burning. The street lamps flickered, as if even light mourned. The Carter home lay in silence, curtains drawn, yet the walls whispered her absence. Claire Monroe said, "Rooms breathe grief louder than people," her tone soft. Mark Rivera said, "Evidence fades, but memories carve." Eyes lowered. Ellen Porter said, "This door is closed for me," her stance stiff. Margaret Carter said, "Her shoes wait, her bed waits, but she does not," tears streaming. Tessa Ward said, "I'll help you keep her name alive," voice trembling. Noah Briggs said, "I should have spoken sooner," regret drowning him. Ethan Vale, in memory, said, "Control was mine," his ghostly echo cruel. Claire whispered, "Control dies with cages," her voice a blade. A music box clicked once, then stopped. Morning broke with fragile light, yet it could not soften the sharp edges of truth. Claire Monroe said, "Justice does not restore, it only records," her voice low. Mark Rivera said, "Records keep us honest," his tone grave. Ellen Porter said, "Honesty doesn't heal wounds," her gaze cold. Margaret Carter said, "Healing is not for me, only memory," clutching her chest. Tessa Ward said, "Memory is how we fight silence," eyes bright despite fatigue. Noah Briggs said, "Silence was my sin," his confession raw. Ethan Vale said, "Silence gave me power," remembered in sneer. Claire whispered, "Your power ended," her tone steel. The sunrise poured across the street like reluctant hope. The final night arrived with silence heavier than storms, carrying every word unspoken. Claire Monroe said, "Her story is written but not forgotten," her voice breaking steady. Mark Rivera said, "We honor her in every truth uncovered," firm. Ellen Porter said, "The city moves on but scars remain," eyes shadowed. Margaret Carter said, "Her laughter still lives in me," her tone fragile but proud. Tessa Ward said, "I will never look away again," vow etched in her face. Noah Briggs said, "I'll live chained by guilt, but chained to truth," his voice hollow. Ethan Vale said, "History bends to power," remembered in silence, his arrogance fading. Claire whispered. Power dies, memory does not. Her words a blade and a prayer. The house exhaled, music box starting once soft, then fading into silence, eternal.